Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and today we're going to be talking about some of my favorite subjects, one of them being the faith, of course. I love talking about the Word of God and seeing how He has worked in our lives and is still working in our lives and will work in our lives. And then also legacy, not just your personal legacy, but how are you building your legacy in your business, your family, and your life? And today we are here with not just a legacy architect, but the legacy architect, Debbie Simmons. So great to have you here. And could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm super excited to be with you guys. And what I would say is, hey, when we look at our lives and our faith journeys and stuff like that, it's like a roller coaster. So buckle up, it's fun, and we kind of figure our way. God's really good about that. But if you look back at my story, one of my big dreams had always been that I would be a young grandma. And I'm a girl that gets things done. So I knew I had to find a guy, fall in love, get married, have children, and then I could be the young grandma, right? And I did really good at that. I went to college. I did get my degree, but I found a guy, fell in love, and we got married. Check, check, check. It was all going well. And lo and behold, we ran into a journey of infertility
Mm.
for numerous years. And, that really, I had always, I had become a Christian as a young child, and I was thinking, I can do anything, right? And here I was with a situation where I couldn't control it and I couldn't make my body work. And I just remember there was this whole identity thing that I went through because, here I am. I feel like a failure as a mom, as a woman, and all this stuff. And I was like, I don't know how to get through this. And I slowly made my way through that. And ultimately, at the very end, it was about 5 years, I did get pregnant and I thought it was twins. And we were super excited. I'm like, I work so hard, man. Let's get them done two at a time because I want four kids. And lo and behold, around 13 weeks, my body started to miscarry and ended up in the
Mm.
emergency room. And I'm like, I'm going to lose everything. I'm going to lose everything. And I don't know how to work my way through this. And they got everything stabilized and they sent me to the high risk doctor that next Monday. And when we were in the waiting room, I looked at my husband and I said, dude, you know, we're going to go in there. They're going to do an ultrasound and we're going to find out that, you know, we weren't losing the kids, but that we were actually having triplets. And I laughed, and I'm like, sure, right, whatever. And he's like, that'd be funny. And I'm like, yeah. And so we go in there and they did the ultrasound. And ultimately, I wasn't pregnant with twins, I was pregnant with quads.
Wow.
So that's four, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so every day became a new journey of learning to trust God in the moment. And we didn't quite know how this was going to work out, but we started going on our journey. And every day we would just continue moving forward. And the goal became to get these babies to 30 weeks. And at 26 weeks, I found myself standing in water and one of the baby's sacs had ruptured, and they put me in the hospital to see if I could go as long as I could in there, but still trying to get him to 30 weeks. And the next morning, contractions broke out, and one of the babies had stuck a hand through my stitch cervix and was waving to the world, "Hello, I'm coming." And I was shocked. And I just was like, can you stop this? Looking at the doctor, can you make this go away? No, it's too early, right? And she was like, no, you have to deliver this child. And I breathed and I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to figure my way through this. And so they put me in surgery, then put me back in the room, and we waited and waited. And then several hours later, a little Zach came and they placed Zach in my arms, and I held him and I loved him. And he took his little hand and he wrapped it around my finger and he squeezed as if to say, Mom, I'm here. And I loved him until he drifted off into eternity. And then we waited because we had to see if my body would be able to carry the other three or would it reject them. And several hours later, I was really sick. The doctor came back in and she said, you have to induce the other three. And I remember looking up at her just for some slight sliver of hope, and she shook her head no. And so I closed my eyes and I was like, okay, God, I, I got to figure my way through this. And a little while later, Josh and then Nate and then Chris each came and they placed them in my arms and I rocked them and held them and loved them until they drifted into eternity. And for me, you don't go to the hospital pregnant planning funerals, right? And so here I sit and I clearly, I've loved Jesus my whole life. And I clearly realize that eternity matters as you hold your kiddos that pass away. And I'm like, okay, God, I, I don't know any other way to get through this other than to trust you. I can't even fathom any other way. And yet I'm like going, I don't even know how to do this. I mean, like, how do you do this? How do people walk through this tragedy? And God taught me something that night. He met me in many unexpected ways, but one of the things that he really challenged me with, he was like, you have to give me your why. And I'm like, wait a second. That's the question that is mine, and I'm not giving it up. If I can just get this answer, then I can figure my way. And he was like, you have to give it to me. And I'm like, absolutely not. And he gently nudged and said, you have to give it to me. And what I realize now is that, if God Himself would have stood in front of me that night and would have answered my question to why, do you know what I would have said? I would have said, why does it have to be that? Because I don't like that answer. Right. And
Right.
so that's what we naturally say. And then if he would have answered something else, I would have said, why? Because that's not good enough. It doesn't bring my boys back. Right. It doesn't solve the problem. And so I literally finally just said, okay, God, I'll give you my why. But what do I do now? Because I don't know. I don't know what to do. And he said, ask me a different question. And I was like, what? I need help here. And he said, ask me, how do I survive? And I was like, okay, how do I survive? Because why is a very stuck question. It's very internal and you can't figure out how to get out of it because there is no good answer to why this side of heaven. Okay, there just isn't. And so, how means that I can actually move forward, right? And I was like, okay. And he taught me take the next best step. And I took the step and he met me there. And then he's like, take another bit, next best step. And I'm like, take another. And what happened was we began to build my faith muscle into something that became really, really strong over time because I was taking all these next steps in just faithful obedience to figure my way through this. And what I found was over time, I learned how to survive, right? And he taught me wonderful things during that time. And then my question began to change. And I said, okay, God, if you've taught me how to survive, I want you to teach me how do I thrive? Because I don't want to die and just be stuck here, like emotionally stuck here.
Right.
I'm too young. I'm too young. I don't want to be this way. And I said, you're a redeemer of stories. So figure out how to make something good out of mine. And that trust and putting that in his hands and going, okay, show me what has been just the wildest ride of being able to work with other people who've lost children, lead grief groups. It ultimately led to us choosing adoption and adopting 9 kids with trauma backgrounds. And then God said, start a ministry. And so I started a ministry that called Anchor Point that blesses families, is about 15 years old. And it impacts thousands of people each and every year. And then he was like, write a book. And so I wrote the book and, and then speaking and doing all these things. So all of these things come out of that pain. And I love to say, we're all going to leave legacies. The only question is, will we live our legacy so we write what we leave, right? And so this has been the journey for me is it all started with my boys. My boys' legacy goes on because of the work that I do. And then I get to live mine now so I can leave it later. And won't it be cool to be in heaven and Anchor Point still be around and some girl be getting help and I'll be up there with Jesus. I'll be like, yeah, do you see that? That's what we did. Thank you for letting me be a part of that. So that's my journey. And ultimately, I did become a grandma. I have 15 grandbabies, so I'm still young enough to get around and do all that with them. So,
That is a very powerful story. I know that's a huge thing that affects families is infertility, and it especially affects Christian households in a sense of, again, that why, God, I thought this was your purpose. I thought the idea was that a man and a woman, turn into one unit, they cleave into one flesh, and they reproduce, they have offspring. That's what was promised. And so I
Mhm.
understand how frustrating that can be for a lot of people who are dealing with that, even more so because of our relationship with God and the promises He has made. And so I want to talk about, so you adopted 9 children, which is a lot. Most people adopt 1 to 3. So how was the decision process behind adopting 9 children? And you mentioned trauma backgrounds. Did you adopt them at all different ages, the same time, from different countries? Like, how did that all work out?
We're crazy, so we just try and be obedient. But we actually we did think about and tried to start getting pregnant again, but it was just too much for me because my I was emotionally, physically
Mm,
uh, exhausted, right? And so I told my husband, I just can't do this. And what happened was I'm an engineer by training, so I worked for Exxon, and over about a 2-year period, God was like, I want you to go into ministry work. So I need you to leave Exxon and go to seminary. And I did that. And my husband changed, got out of graduate school, went to work at NASA, and we changed careers paths. And God put me to work in church settings. And once we had gotten through my seminary stage, when we were together in South Carolina, I was like, if we're going to try and get pregnant, we better get started because I'm not getting any younger. And my young grandma thing is is on the horizon. I got to get busy. And my husband was like, no, we should maybe we should consider adoption. And, and this thought process went through our head is, there's a lot of children that sit in our CPS foster care systems that are legally free, which means their parental rights have all been severed and they just need homes. Okay. And so we kind of started exploring this option of whether or not maybe that might be a good option for us. And we could spend literally millions of dollars trying to get pregnant, or we could get children through CPS and foster care and spend millions of dollars there. And so that was kind of our thought process, and we began to explore it. So we did not feel called to international adoption, and we also didn't feel called to infant adoption because I was like, if we're going to adopt, we want I wanted 4, remember from the beginning. So I was like, okay, God, we'll just get a sibling group. And so we started working with an agency in South Carolina. And our first adoption, we ended up adopting a sibling group of 5. And they were 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And so they were fun. We moved a small basketball team in the house. And from there to a basketball team, it was like crazy. And so definitely rocked our little world because, my youngest one, even on the first day he came in from playing outside and he stood in front of me and this little boy looked up at me and he's like, what's for dinner? And I looked at him, I was like, do you ask this question every day? And he's looking at me like, yeah. And I'm like, I am really not prepared because I don't really cook. So I'm like going, oh my gosh, this is like serious. Fortunately for us, I had finished my master's in organizational management. So I put that to work and set up systems and procedures and everything so we could survive. And we thought really 5 was it. And that's a pretty big number, right? And we
right.
love those kids, and they do have trauma backgrounds and same mom, different dads, and all kind of issues that we deal with, but they're wonderful kids. And about 8 years after we had them, I felt like God was calling us to be o obedient, to put our application in again and consider adopting again. And my husband was like, no way, man. We got 5 kids. This is too much. And I was like, you need to start praying about it because I'm just telling you, we need to do this. And so he did. And after about 6 weeks, he said, okay. And my kids were all in, but I was like, have you guys counted the cost? Because this is going to cost us, And so we went through this exercise and they were like, maybe I can't play select softball, or maybe, I'm gonna have to share my toys or share my space or do all this. And I said, let mom help you. How about mom can't pay for your car? Mom can't pay for your insurance. Mom can't pay for college. Mom can't pay for your marriages. But I do know that God will help us figure all that out. But so we turned our stuff in, and within a year, we had another sibling group of two, and they were out of the CPS system in Texas, and they were 11 and 13, and my others were 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And that got us seven, and we thought that was it. And lo and behold, about 3 years later, I was telling my husband, God's telling us to turn our stuff in. And I said, I don't really want to adopt, but I know we're supposed to turn it in. And I had a daughter who had one of my grandbabies, and it looked like that grandbaby could possibly end up in CPS custody. And I wanted to be in a place where we would be prepared if that's what God led us to do. So my husband held out for 6 months and praying about it. And then finally he said yes. And fortunately, my grandbaby did not end up in CPS custody. I learned wonderful information about trauma-informed care from Dr. Karen Purvis through some training that we did that actually blessed our family, but changed what we do ministry-wise too. And we ended up with two more kids. So then we had a 9-year-old, an 11-year-old, 13, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. The list goes on. So it's three different
Right.
adoptions, three sibling groups. So we have what we call a blended family. So, and it's a fun journey. It's a hard journey, but it definitely is in the center of God's heart. Adoption is, and we've been super blessed, and we are better people for doing it.
Right. Now, during this time, you talk about the ministry, and then is the ministry and Anchor Point separate, or they kind of work in tandem?
Oh no, Anchor Point is the ministry that I
Okay.
started. Yeah, so I started that before we got number 6 and 7, and God led us to start that, which that was a real faith journey because I'm like looking at it, I'm like, God, I got a I work in full-time ministry. At that point, I worked for a prison fellowship and ran 4 states of prison ministry. And I'm going, I got a full-time mission field at my house that you've given me, and you want me to start a ministry. And I was like, you got the wrong girl. And you don't win those things with God. Over time, he's going to encourage you to do it. And he did. He allowed my job at Prison Fellowship to go away in about a week. And I was like, okay, God, I'll do what you're asking me to do. And so we started this. And I'm an engineer. Nonprofit wasn't on my thing. I just knew to do the next best thing and that he would help me figure it out, which is exactly what I learned when I was in the hospital room. Right. And so he has faithfully blessed that. And I fortunately have become a much more yes girl before he even asked now. So I've learned to grow in that way as I've gone through life.
Right. And so taking us through that journey over the past several years, what has the ministry done and looked like and kind of evolved?
Sure. Yeah. First of all, it starts out helping one, right? You just start with one. And this ministry really focuses on giving families hope. So we do that through multi different organizations that we have. We have a medical clinic that works with guys and gals that are struggling with choosing life for their kid. And we provide them services there and take care of them and really take care of, make sure that they have all the medical information that they need to be able to choose life. And then we have our case management, our Hope Family Center, which is where we do one-on-one case management with these individuals, both a baby mom and baby dad, because kids don't come with instruction manuals. And so they are the instruction manuals. And when you're pregnant, you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. So you need people to walk alongside of you. And so that is exactly what we do. And we look at not only, financially, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, resource wise, what is it that you need help with that we can help show you the way? And so we kind of walk them through a plan to help them do that because we want them to be successful. And we want to break cycles so that their children don't end up back in our care. And then we have our Hope initiatives, which are actually our parenting and prenatal classes, recovery groups for individuals that have struggled with sexual abuse or abortion or just general trauma. And then we run a maternity home for girls that are homeless and pregnant and trying to figure their way. And that's a 24/7, 18 months program to get the baby here for and celebrate that. And then also look at what they need educationally to be able to support them and the child that they carry. Just help lift the tide of parenting because it is hard. And we know that our communities are only as strong as our weakest families. And so this is our gift to our area, and then that has ripple effects for throughout the state and beyond, and then for eternity too. So
Right, and I have a lot of respect for what you do because I work in abortion alternatives work. I had a pregnancy support guide up for a while that is currently down because I'm adding to it. And what I found in that work is that over 75% of abortions or the result of financial hardship, and so it's truly, truly devastating to know that we have sports athletes and making millions of dollars. We have pop stars and singers making millions of dollars. We send millions of dollars to other countries. Yet we have our own American women killing their children because they can't afford to have them. And there's so much money going to other things. I mean, even if you look at the budget for one movie and every streaming service, if they release one less movie a day and donate that money to abortion prevention, we could have so many more lives. And it's just truly I'm very distraught over it because no one should have to choose between their child and financial stability in this day and age. I think it is just very tragic and very evil that our society has come to this point. So I have a lot of respect for the work that you do with, especially a lot of young women, unfortunately, because of the sexual immorality nowadays. There are a lot of young pregnant women who don't have a supportive male figure in their life.
mhm. And I think, finances, it definitely ends up being an issue sometimes for sure, like you said. But you know what I really find is the biggest difference is that if we just stop and we give her hope that there is a way through, and like all the issues, living issues, finance issues, all these things will work itself out over time, and it will help you each step of the way, just that little bit of hope because girls are wired to carry. And so they're looking for that spark of hope that's always there. And no matter what the situation was, and how do we help them? Lean into that. And, ultimately, I do believe that Jesus is the answer. And if we can give them hope that, lasts for eternity, what power there is in that. And then, that is the King of Kings that has money unlimited that will help her figure her way. And so it's a twofold thing, but the hope is the most powerful. It's more powerful than anything in what we can give them. And so my leaning in and giving of myself to her is oftentimes the borrowed hope that she needs to be able to make these choices. And it's wonderful. I love the ministry's 15 years old, and I have some of those kiddos. They're taller than me now, and I'm going, it's so cool, from that perspective to see their beautiful faces, and it's really worth it.
I 100% agree. And now, through all this, we've covered your work into ministry, into motherhood, into grandmotherhood. Where does the legacy architect come into play?
Sure. Well, God's never done with your story, right? And so he's always challenging you to be more of an impact player, or he at least gives you the opportunity, right? And so a couple of years ago, God was like, I want you to write a book. And I'm like, no, God. Don't make me do this. And so I ended up, of course, writing a book, and it's called The Heart of Legacy. It encaptures my story, and it talks about how Anchor Point came to be. It has wonderful life change stories in there, but it's about how you and I can be focused, faithful, and fearless. Okay. Because I believe God wants us to all be that. And if we could all lean into what God has us here for, then what what an impact that would make. Just think of all the ripples that it would make. And so for me, I get the most excited in my life when I'm just getting the honor of walking alongside of someone and helping them figure out what they were here to be, the impact that they were to make. And so I go, the heart of legacy is really about all of us doing that. And so as I've gotten older and the ministry continues to grow, we know one day that I'm going to need to retire, right? And so God challenged me to do the book and to begin doing coaching and to begin talking about the idea of living your legacy so you have a legacy to leave. And really going, how many people can we help walk along in this process and encourage them to do the courageous things that God is calling us to do and go, we don't have to live stuck in the why. We can learn to
Right.
ask the how questions, and we can learn how to thrive even after difficult situations. And that is the most contagious thing to get people excited in their own walks, right? Is us telling our story and stuff like that. So that is what he's done with me is he's moved me into more leadership development, coaching, and things like that while I'm still CEO, but we're raising up those teams within the ministry to keep it going long term, even when one day I'm not here, even though I'm not planning leaving right now. But
Right.
we all need to plan because how we plan for successors is very important. And if you're the founder, it's really hard to replace you sometimes in an organization. So you have to help them really know how to do that well. And we just want to lay those seeds well. So that is how the legacy architect came into being is now I get to help people, and I have a concept called the architecture of trust. And that says that we all trust something and you really know what you trust when the pressure rises.
Mm.
Okay. And so for you and me as believers, we like to say that we trust Jesus, right? With everything. But the truth of the matter is, when the pressure comes on, what do I default to? Do I default to urgency? Do I default to control or silence or whatever? These are all my survival mechanisms that aren't bad. They're just things I default into. And ultimately, they take the place of trusting God. So something in my structure has to change, whether that is, I need a system or a rhythm or whatever, but I need to be able to put my trust over here in Jesus. So love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control flow out of me, right?
Right.
So I just give you an example, one of my children lived on the streets addicted to drugs for numerous years. And I'm a control person. And so, when I start thinking about that, I don't start trusting Jesus. I'm like, how can I control that? How can I get this girl out of
Right.
that? And how can I do this and everything? And God's like, do you believe I love her more than you do?
Mm.
And absolutely not. You know, because I'm totally human, right? I'm like, absolutely not. And I, of course, could solve the situation. So you need to put me in charge. And he's like, you have to trust me with her. And I'm going, "Ugh." And that means I have to be humble and willing to grow, but I also have to be willing to surrender. And I have to know that he does love her more than I do and that he's writing a good story. And I can lean into that. Otherwise, I try and be the rescuer and everything like that. And what she really needs is she really needs Jesus. Now,
Mm.
fortunately for us, 7 years later, she's off the streets and she's been now 3 years sober and doing really good. But it taught me a lot about what do I trust, right? And if I'm trusting my ability to control it, then now I bring stress in and worry and all these things that eat away at my body and make me not function as well as I could. And so, that architecture of trust is what do you trust? And it shows up when pressure does. And that just is a point for you to learn, maybe I need to make some adjustments. And it's a journey. It's our journey that we go on of learning to trust more and more and more. And that's the journey of looking more and more like him.
Right. I agree 100%. And for most believers, surrendering is the most difficult part. Surrendering to the full extent. We always try to hold on to just a little piece of it to be in control. Now, and part of that surrendering is what you mentioned earlier is saying yes before you even know what it is or why, just knowing that if God is saying, all right, I'm on board, you have already prepared a way for me. So, of course, I'll say yes. And then, what would be another roadblock that people often face when it comes to living a focused, faithful, and fearless life? What is, in addition to surrender and trust, which go hand in hand, what is a big obstacle that many people are facing, either knowingly or unknowingly?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest ones is are we humble?
Mm,
Are we willing to grow? And it's so funny. God gave me 9 kids because, every time you lose it with a kid, it just means you got something in your history to work on. And God gave me 9 because I had a lot of work to do. And so I just got really good at realizing when I'm losing it and I can't be the boss or the wife or the mom that I want to be, and I'm not showing fruits of the spirit, then you know what? I'm like, okay, God, show me what I need to work on. Show me where you're growing me and you're stretching me. Where am I getting it wrong? Because you say I can have all these things in all situations. I can have joy in everything. And I'm like, I don't feel joy right now. So help me figure my way. And he just really, he promises he'll give us wisdom and he promises he'll teach us, right? But that means we have to be teachable. And to be teachable means
right.
I have to be humble. And I have to realize that I have to grow and I have to, because we do want, I mean, I think all of us, our intentions are really good, but it is really hard to surrender because I'm really selfish and I like my stuff and I like my way. And so,
Right.
you know, getting a heart that really says, okay, God, I want to lean in, and realizing that, hey, it might not look exactly like I planned, but it's still going to be a good journey. So I think that's really the biggest thing. The other thing for me that I think a lot of people struggle with is our life moves at such a fast pace that we just don't stop. And so to hear his voice or to, understand that, hey, maybe I am stressed out and maybe I do need to work on some things because the pace of our lives nowadays is just so fast. And so even when I'm working with leaders, a lot of times, the first thing I make them do is sit still and just listen and let your mind stop and just focus. And that is so powerful. So I think, between humility, surrender, and learning to stop, those are the things that are for me have always been the biggest challenge.
And then I want to clarify for everyone listening, you talk about coaching, speaking, the book writing, and working with people. Who are the people who will benefit the most from what you do and from hearing your message?
Sure. I do have some resources and you can find those on my website in regards to if you're struggling with like maybe some trauma or depression and stuff like that. I have a course called Unstuck for Good, which might be really good for that. But the people that I spend most of my time kind of coaching with are what we would call successful kind of executives that are out there that have a lot of times everything looks good. They're meeting the numbers, they're exceeding things, they're doing stuff, and they're getting to their next levels. And then what they what happens is they're asking the question, is this all there is to life? And they do one of two things. Either they default back to control or hustle and just start going after bigger and better things, or they realize that internally something is different than what used to bring them fulfillment externally. And so God is actually asking that question and getting them to
Mm.
pause and stop because He has something better for them. It may be going back to the same job and taking it to the next level, but having a different purpose when you go. But these executives generally don't stop. And so we really look at, okay, you're successful, but what does significance look like? And significance is what you're looking for. And oftentimes, when we have that disconnect internally and externally, it is God raising us up for what's next. And what the systems that we have, the trust systems that we have, won't get us there. So we've got to become the person that He's calling us to be. And that is who I spend most of my time with is executives that have been successful and everything looks good from the world's perspective, but they're just not, they don't feel significant yet anymore. And they want significance. So
And then as we wrap up this episode, what I like to ask every faith-based guest is if you could share one Bible quote from your heart right now, what would that be and why?
Okay, I would do Romans 15:13, and I'm not going to get it totally exactly right, but really it talks about may the God of hope fill you with joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And
Mm.
really, hope, joy, trust, those are my things. And I want to be a person that overflows with those things. And so that is really it for me in a nutshell, is I want those things and God offers them to us if we just lean in.
I agree 100%. And we have to remember it's not just a piece of this world as the world gives, but a piece that only He can give that is really fulfilling to your life and will definitely help with that emptiness, that feeling of purposelessness. A lot of us have chased after a purpose that is of this world or with the world and not our God-given purpose. We have ignored our God call, our calling from God, whether that's not using the gifts he gave us for the right reason or at all, or constantly deviating to what we want. So I think it's really important to not only lean into that, but to learn how to discern that, and spending time in the Word and with Him is the best way to do that. But Ms. Simmons, so great to have you here. We're going to have your website in the description below for people to check out your speaking, your book, your resources, and then, of course, they can contact you if they want to work with you further and enjoyed what you said. Hopefully, you and I have planted some seeds today of the word. And again, as I always say, seeds of a tree whose shade we may never sit under. Like you said, that long after you're gone, that people are still being changed by what you've done here. And that's true legacy is leaving behind all this stuff for God to work with. Our legacy is leaving something for God to use for the greater good to serve others. So I think that's really important, and I want to thank you for your time today.
Yeah, and I had a great time with you guys.